Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're unpacking what has to be one of the most controversial and honestly fascinating premises you'll probably ever come across in biblical discourse. We are going to examine a fringe theory that asks a pretty startling question. Was the Apostle Paul actually an agent of Satan? Now, right off the bat, we're not here to take sides or tell you what to believe. Instead, we're going to objectively map out exactly how this theory is constructed by a prominent online voice, and then we'll look at how a scientific, text-critical analysis deconstructs those very same arguments. It is a brilliant case study in how ancient texts are interpreted, debated, and sometimes, well, completely turned upside down.
Okay, let's dive into this. The core claim made by the YouTube channel Contrarian Christianity is that early Christianity was essentially corrupted from within. The theory asserts that Paul didn't just have, normal theological disagreements with the original apostles, but that he was an active imitation of Christ, literally an instrument of Satan, purposefully spreading falsehoods to lead believers astray. That is a massive claim, right? It entirely reframes the entire New Testament.
So, here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be going through 1. A provocative theological claim. 2. Numerology and symbols. 3. Elevating apocryphal texts. 4. Forgeries and conspiracies. 5. Real theological tensions. And finally, 6. The closed logical loop.
Section 1. A provocative theological claim. The case against Paul. Section 2. Numerology and symbols. Uncovering the numbers.
So, to build a case against Paul, this theory first has to tear down the whole idea that the Protestant Bible is absolutely perfect. The theorist asserts that God actually allowed Satan to place deliberate falsehoods right alongside Scripture, basically as a test for believers. And they try to prove this using numbers, arguing that Satan's influence over the biblical canon is mathematically visible. They point out that the standard Protestant Bible has 66 books, which they link directly to 666, the mark of the beast. Furthermore, they heavily emphasize the number 13, which they identify as the number of the occult and death. The Old Testament, they claim, is structured in 3 sets of 13 books. And Paul, well, he wrote exactly 13 epistles. They ask a pretty provocative question. Why would God's infallible word be mathematically tied to death and the beast?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can directly contrast the YouTuber's symbolic connections with the analytical text's actual critique. The YouTuber points to what they call red flags in the text, like a blinded Paul being sent to the house of Judas in Damascus, or the fact that Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin, whose ancient symbol is a wolf. They link this right back to Jesus' warning of wolves in sheep's clothing. But when we look at the critical analysis, it points out that from a logical, scientific standpoint, this is a completely subjective theological interpretation. It relies on loose symbolic associations rather than any real empirical or historical evidence.
Section 3. Elevating apocryphal texts outside the canon.
So if the standard Bible is corrupted, where exactly does the theory find its truth? Well, the YouTuber frequently cites extra-biblical or apocryphal texts, treating them basically as unquestionable historical fact to build their narrative. These primary texts include the Clementine Homilies, the Book of Enoch, the Damascus Document, and the Gospel of Thomas. They argue that Satan worked through historical councils to bury these specific books precisely because they expose Paul's lies.
And this brilliantly illustrates how those specific texts are weaponized. Using the Clementine Homilies, the YouTuber claims apostles Peter and James were strict vegetarians living in severe poverty. They then juxtapose this directly against Paul's letters, where Paul essentially criticizes those whose weak faith allows them to eat only vegetables. Using the Gospel of Thomas, they argue Jesus intended to make women equal to men, which starkly contrasts with Paul's commands for women to remain silent in church. The analytical source, however, steps in here and notes that this is a highly selective elevation of extra-biblical sources. The theorist is essentially cherry-picking outside texts that support their narrative while totally dismissing canonical texts that don't.
Section 4. Forgeries and Conspiracies. The 2 Peter Problem.
Now, the theory runs into a massive hurdle right inside the Bible itself. In the second epistle of Peter, the Apostle Peter explicitly calls Paul a beloved brother and elevates his writings to the exact same level as Scripture. Obviously, if Peter endorses Paul, the whole Paul is a false apostle theory kind of falls apart, right? So how does the YouTuber handle this? They claim it's a straight-up forgery. They argue that if you simply delete the 1.5 verses praising Paul, the surrounding text flows perfectly from verse 14 straight to verse 17. They argue a later scribe just slipped those words in to give Paul legitimacy, claiming Peter would never ever call a writer of Scripture a mere brother.
But the critical analysis pushes back hard on this, stating that a text flows better when you just remove a paragraph is absolutely not historical proof of a forgery. The analytical source labels this a totally insufficient and manipulative argument. Because honestly, labeling a text as a forgery simply because it contradicts your specific theory, without any actual manuscript evidence to back it up, well, that's just a pure conspiracy approach.
Section 5. Real theological tensions. Finding the friction.
Now, it's not all numerology and conspiracy. The critical analysis points out there actually are genuine discrepancies in the texts. Let's move to Jerusalem and see how this builds across the book of Acts. The YouTuber rightly points out that Paul's famous conversion story changes depending on exactly who he's talking to. In Acts 9, his companions hear the voice. In Acts 22, when he's speaking to Jewish leaders, suddenly they don't understand the voice, and a second witness, Ananias, is heavily featured. But by Acts 26, when he's speaking to King Agrippa, Ananias is dropped entirely, and the story is all about Paul's direct revelation. The YouTuber sees a liar changing his story. Text critics see natural literary variation. But both agree the discrepancy is totally real.
There's also real theological friction here. Both the YouTuber and biblical scholars acknowledge that Paul's teachings sometimes absolutely clash with the Jerusalem apostles. Paul preaches salvation by faith alone and grace, and even introduces an exception for divorce if a believer is abandoned by an unbeliever. The original apostles, on the other hand, seem to lean heavily towards faith and works and strict adherence to dietary laws, like absolutely forbidding meat sacrificed to idols, which is something Paul was way more flexible on. The friction is undeniable, even if jumping to the conclusion that Paul is Satan's agent is, a massive leap.
Section 6. The closed logical loop. Anatomy of dogma.
So the crucial point is how this theory ultimately operates. It forms what the analysis calls a closed conspiracy loop. It is a completely self-sealing reasoning structure. Think about it. The premise is that the Bible contains satanic lies designed to test us. Therefore, any scripture that supports Paul, like 2 Peter, is simply dismissed as one of those lies or a forgery. Any outside text that attacks Paul, well, that's embraced as suppressed truth. It becomes an impenetrable dogmatic polemic. It's no longer a scientific argument because it is designed a set of rules where it literally cannot be proven wrong by the text.
Which leaves us with a final, really big question to chew on. How do we separate historical truth from dogmatic polemics? When we are studying ancient texts, how much of what we find is actually right there in the text, and how much is shaped by the ideological frameworks we bring to it? This explainer shows just how easily a narrative can be constructed when you get to choose exactly which pieces of evidence count and which ones are just thrown out. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the hard questions.